Greetings, everyone. It is great to be here with you tonight on yet another Great Decisions discussion program. And tonight, we're really going to be discussing a most important topic, not just for Pennsylvania or for the United States, but for the entire world. And to join us in the discussion of the struggle over the Arctic is a man who has made a name for himself around the world because of his commitment to helping to educate us all about global warming and the impact that climate change is having on people here and everywhere. And even more important than that, the morality or the immorality of not paying attention to this issue. It's this climate change ethical behavior that I think Don Brown, who is with us, will be talking about tonight as well. So Don, I want to welcome you. And for all of the folks here, I want to say thank you for joining us. Thanks to the Frederickson Library, once again, for sponsoring this program, our Great Decisions series. And now I'm just going to ask you when to relax. We're going to do the screen share. We're going to watch the video from the Foreign Policy Association. And then I'm going to come back and I will give a proper introduction to Don Brown, and he will offer opening remarks. And then we will engage in discussion, Q&A back and forth. So sit tight, let me do the tech stuff here, and then we'll get our program underway.
For all of recorded, anyone seeking access to the vast, untapped riches of the Arctic has faced one key obstacle: ice. But the frozen North is no longer quite so frozen. As the polar ice cap retreats, the Arctic is becoming a focus for economic development and geopolitical rivalry. Great Decisions investigates the ambitions of Arctic powers, both old and new, and asks whether a spirit of cooperation can endure in one of the Earth's most inhospitable regions. The fight over the melting Arctic. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The old mariners fought for the Northwest Passage because they believed it would prove a short commercial route between the East and the West. The route which Amundsen has located will be of considerable use to whalers, but it is unlikely that anything else will come of it. National Geographic Magazine, 1906.
By the time the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen completed the first transit of the Northwest Passage, it was widely understood that Arctic shipping routes offered no commercial value. But now, more than a century later, the Arctic is changing.
In 2019, Anchorage, Alaska experienced the highest recorded temperature in the history of their state. If there's any pretense about us being in denial about climate change, all they have to do is look to Anchorage and understand that it's the honest-to-God truth.
In July of 2020, Arctic sea ice cover hit its lowest ever recorded level. Scientists are predicting in the next decade or so, we may start to see some ice-free summers.
Climate change is going to impact the Arctic and going to impact the conditions of navigation. It could shorten the trip from Asia to Europe. If instead of taking the south route, you could go north along Russia.
In 2016, the Crystal Serenity cruise ship became the largest passenger vessel to sail through the Northwest Passage. It sailed from Vancouver to New York. We're at the beginning of what we can anticipate will be an increase in shipping into the high latitudes.
The melting of Arctic ice is making it easier than ever to access the region's untapped mineral wealth.
Ice melting has both positive and negative consequences. Access to the hydrocarbons and other mineral resources and bioresources in the Arctic is expanding.
13% of the world's undiscovered conventional oil resources reside in the Arctic. 30% of the undiscovered natural gas, nearly $1 trillion worth of minerals, including gold and gem-quality diamonds.
Geopolitical strategists around the world have taken note of the Arctic's new possibilities. Today, many countries are working to expand their influence at the top of the world.
The heightened interest in the Arctic has brought China and Russia together. As Russia and China become more active in the region, the US has realized that it needs to increase its engagement.
The region has become an arena for power and for competition. And the 8 Arctic states must adapt to this new future.
During the Cold War, the Arctic became a battleground as the US and the Soviet Union faced off across the pole.
What was once the impassable Arctic now provides the quickest routes for attack from a wide sector of Europe and Asia.
Geopolitical competition is going to become a more dominant feature of the Arctic. And this is also an area that the United States has somewhat neglected over the past few years.
When we thought the threat of over-the-pole ballistic missile attacks had ended, we were premature in our view that competition in the Arctic had diminished. And I think we will now pay a price for having to hurry to catch up.
Ура!
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Путин.
Vladimir Putin has quietly worked to strengthen Russia's strategic position in the Arctic to a level not seen since the Cold War.
The Russian president has very clearly explained that one of his main goals for Russia's Arctic policy is to develop the northern sea routes. It would mean upgrading a lot of transport infrastructure, port infrastructure, and so on.
They're not messing around. They understand the value of the Arctic. They're establishing bases and activity up there, natural resource extraction.
They have the most modernized strategic and nuclear submarines very close to Norway, but they have a bigger strategic ambition. And that I would say is mainly the strategic competition between Russia and the United States.
We are strengthening scientific, transport, navigation, and military infrastructure, which will allow us to secure Russia's interests in this strategically important region.
Some experts contend that Russia's military buildup should not be seen as a provocation.
Former Soviet facilities are being opened back up. They're building out additional infrastructure there, modern infrastructure. They're putting in longer runways. But a lot of what I have seen and what I've heard is that it's defensive in orientation.
Well, you could ask me if I'm concerned. I'm not. I think if that is a threat to anyone, it's a threat to the polar bears primarily. There's a need to have some sort of security presence in that enormous space.
Russia, perpetually strapped for cash, has been forced to turn for help to the newest player in the region, China.
After 2014 and the Western sanctions on Russia following Crimea annexation, Russia had no other choice than to turn toward China and accept Chinese investment. Russia and China are cooperating quite closely on the Yamal liquid natural gas project.
Yamal Peninsula is in the Russian high north. It has a large natural gas reserve, but Russia for a very long time has not had the ability to explore that natural gas because it requires large amount of financial capital.
Although Russia and China have cooperated effectively on oil and gas exploration, experts caution that the two countries' interests in the Arctic do not always align.
On the one hand, China is perceived by Russia as a promising partner in the Arctic. But on the other hand, the Sino-Russian relationship in the Arctic is sort of a marriage of convenience. Russia has no illusions about Chinese interests.
Russia strongly identifies as an Arctic state and would be unwilling to countenance a partnership with China where it's no longer the leader in that region. I think China is mindful of that and has tread cautiously with Russia in the Arctic.
As China has ramped up its investment around the world, the Arctic has become part of its global strategy.
China has integrated the Arctic in its Belt and Road initiative, calling it the Polar Silk Road. And the idea is to build infrastructure to be able to use the region as a shipping route.
The 2018 Arctic White Paper by China states what national interest China sees for itself in the Arctic. Chinese are quite clear that they have an economic interest in the Arctic, and they have interest in the governance issue in the Arctic because the changes in the Arctic region has a global impact.
Chinese companies have sought investment opportunities in every Arctic country. But to local officials wary of China's ambitions, such investment is not always welcome.
China will use the same methods that it has done in the rest of the world to promote a Chinese agenda that is not just about making money, but it's also about establishing a strategic foothold.
China's actions in Greenland have been very controversial. Chinese construction companies bid to renovate 3 airports, and that elicited concern in the United States. And Secretary of State Pompeo approached Denmark to warn them against this.
I think we should pay attention to anything that is a precursor to military presence in the Arctic. Investment in Greenland's airport for tourism, benign. Investment in Greenland's airport where you might ultimately control that as a base, not benign.
For many years, China controversially sought membership in the Arctic Council, an intergovernmental forum for the 8 Arctic countries to discuss common issues. In 2013, China finally earned observer status within the council.
China has successfully got itself into the room of the Arctic Council, but the does not yet have a seat at the table. So that actually has created quite a lot of frustration in China about its Arctic policy.
Many years ago, we kind of had the Arctic to ourselves, but the latest development is that also non-Arctic states are very eager to take part in I think what they see as an Arctic adventure.
One of China's arguments is that because climate change in the Arctic is a threat multiplier, it affects China as well as Arctic states. But Arctic states claim that they are the stewards of the region and other states outside it should play by their rules.
American policymakers have taken an especially dim view of China's interest in the Arctic. In May 2019, at the Arctic Council ministerial meeting, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo castigated Beijing for its behavior in the region.
There are only Arctic states and non-Arctic states. No third category exists, and claiming otherwise entitles China to exactly nothing.
Being there in the audience in that very speech, it was rather strange. There has been some sort of agreement that this is for functional cooperation. So let's keep it like that.
The criticisms and accusations made by individuals on the American side regarding China's involvement in Arctic affairs are completely inconsistent with the facts. Moreover, they are contrary to the general trend of peaceful cooperation in the Arctic.
Mike Pompeo placed the Arctic in the context of great power competition, which was also unusual for the Arctic Council because the Arctic Council does not deal with security issues.
In Mike Pompeo's defense, anytime you try to ignore reality for collegiality, you'll lose collegiality more permanently. It's very important that we recognize that our challenges with China and our challenges with Russia, we can't pretend they don't exist.
In 2019, an unusual proposal brought the Trump administration's Arctic strategy to the top of the nightly news.
The Wall Street Journal is reporting today that President Donald Trump and his senior advisors have floated the idea of purchasing Greenland. Officials from Greenland, which is an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark, have responded by publicly declaring that their island is not for sale.
Although the plan to buy Greenland was swiftly dismissed, American policymakers are paying more and more attention to the Earth's largest island.
The US has opened a consulate in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, in May 2020.
It's a statement of America's commitment to the Arctic as non-Arctic states look to exploit the region for their own interests, as I warned of back at the Arctic Council.
The US has also approved of a minor aid package to Greenland. That's for purposes such as economic development, so that Greenland, for example, can start making money on tourism. That was one of the areas where China was interested in investing.
I think a lot of people don't know that we have an air base up in Greenland, the very tip top. I've been there a couple of times. Our facilities in Greenland, they're the pickets. They are the eyes and ears for the U.S., watching for threats coming from the east.
In Alaska, experts are sounding the alarm about the lack of American infrastructure in Arctic waters. The U.S., they say, is not prepared for the coming surge of shipping.
It reminds me of the stories of the early Arctic explorers, many of whom were, of course, rescued by Inuit. We will be, in all likelihood, the first responders because of the lack of infrastructure and availability of response services throughout the Arctic.
We're going to need icebreaker capacity to be available. We're going to need more Coast Guard investment. They need a full base on the western coast of Alaska that's fully operational and available.
In April of 2019, the Navy and Coast Guard awarded a contract to VT Halter Marine for the detailed design and construction of a polar security cutter. When we think about our maritime national security objectives and the need to support economic and commercial and our scientific interests, it's just critical that we begin to field these polar security cutters.
Fundamental to U.S. Arctic policy is the question of how to balance the Arctic's economic potential with global climate concerns.
For security purposes alone, the United States shouldn't be holding back on its oil and gas production capability. What we don't produce, the Saudis will, the Russians will, the Venezuelans will, and I believe it's very important for the United States to be a player in the global energy market.
We've already discovered enough fossil fuel reserves to push us beyond the safe level of warming that was agreed to in the Paris Climate Accords. Opening up new areas like the Arctic is completely inconsistent with limiting climate change to a safe level.
Now, policymakers must decide whether it is wise for the U.S. to spend the billions of dollars that would be required to turn the Arctic into a geopolitical battleground.
It's very expensive, both to build and to maintain. But if the United States is committed to this competition with China and with Russia, and if we believe that the Arctic is a worthwhile domain of that competition, this is the kind of investments that are necessary for us to be able to sustain that kind of intense engagement that's going to be required.
What we need is not competition. What we need is collaboration. It's a lot easier to work on the assumption that competition is inevitable, and therefore to funnel yet more money to the Navy and to the Air Force so that they can undertake this militarization of the Arctic. I think that would be a large mistake.
When the Arctic Council was founded in 1996, its members agreed to use the forum to discuss environmental and cultural issues rather than security.
The Arctic Council has as its primary objective to promote cooperation, coordination and interaction between the Arctic states and the Arctic inhabitants. It is explicitly stated that the Arctic Council is not dealing with military security. It's probably one of the main contributing factors to the Arctic Council being able to continue to operate, I would say, relatively unimpeded.
It has now a heavy emphasis on sort of climate change, environmental issues, practical economic cooperation between the participating states. I don't see that as changing. Security issues, I think, will be fairly difficult to bring into it.
Although the Arctic Council members had long cooperated on environmental issues, climate change became an unprecedented sticking point at the Council's 2019 summit in Finland.
In May 2019, the Arctic Council meeting was the first time that there was not a common declaration that was adopted at the end. And the main reason was that the United States did not want climate change to be mentioned.
We didn't sign today the Arctic Declaration. It is clear that the climate issues are different from the different viewpoints and from the different capitals.
Arctic Council ministerial meeting in Rovaniemi, Finland in May 2019 displayed that there are some new challenges. And the indigenous peoples organizations definitely expressed our concerns about that, as climate change is a major concern for us.
Some experts believe that if the Arctic Council is to remain collegial, it may be necessary to find a new forum to encourage dialogue between the U.S. and its strategic rivals.
NATO allies and Russia, they have a body called the NATO-Russia Council. That's where the NATO allies discuss security and defense with Russia, and that should be the place where we continue to go and discuss these issues.
What we need to do is to be able to meet those nations with military forces up there and talk about confidence building measures. Talk about other ways that we can avoid surprising each other with military deployments. I would use a fora that's not set up yet, but I would use one that is not the Arctic Council.
Because the capitals of all 8 Arctic nations lie below the Arctic Circle, it will be essential for policymakers to listen to those who live in the region.
What I learned at being in the Senate is their inability to understand on the ground what's going on is pretty high. They don't live there. They don't live in a community that's 30 below. If the local communities in the state are not engaged, then it will be, in my view, a long-term disaster for the area.
If one recognizes that every matter in the Arctic region is interrelated, then the issues of security, militarization, stability, and all of the related matters concern us, concern the people who rely upon this environment.
Despite rising geopolitical tensions, the people who live in the Arctic are confident that the connections between neighbors will remain stronger than the forces of division.
Our fear is that if there is an increased militarization of the areas, that the opportunities and the possibilities for us as one people to interact could be affected. But we also put a lot of confidence in the Arctic Council and that body for being an arena for discussion and dialogue between neighbors.
Residents of the Arctic have long shared bonds that transcend national boundaries, forged by the common experience of life in a severe environment. Now, those bonds are being tested as the Earth's great powers turn their attention toward the top of the world.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit.
Okay, we are back. And boy, there's a lot to unpack in that video, but I am delighted to tell you that we have someone eminently qualified to talk about just what is happening, what are the repercussions that we can't even imagine about the climate change and the warming of the Arctic. So I'm pleased to introduce to you now Don Brown, who is a scholar in residence, sustainability, ethics, and law at Weidner University Commonwealth Law School, and he's also an adjunct associate professor at Gettysburg College. Don Brown has taught interdisciplinary courses on climate change and sustainable development at Penn State. He also directed the Pennsylvania Environmental Research Consortium, an organization of 56 Pennsylvania universities and the Pennsylvania Departments of Environmental Protection and Conservation and Natural Resources. And Don Brown has worked as a program manager for the United Nations organizations at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of International Environmental Policy, and he's represented the agency on U.S. delegations to the United Nations, negotiating climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable development issues. And I will tell you also, in 2019, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, presented Brown one of its most prestigious awards for his advocacy on behalf of the world's poor, who are most directly and urgently feeling the impacts of climate change. And I can tell you, he's spoken at the World Affairs Council on many different occasions. And what we have been most impressed about is his commitment, his call for morality, the immorality of ignoring climate change and its impact, as we saw, even on people in the Arctic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed professor, Don Brown, to offer his remarks, and then we're going to question him for the rest of the night. Go ahead, Don. You have to unmute. Yeah. There you go.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your overgenerous introduction.
I could have gone on and on.
Yeah, well, it's all right. Well, I'm delighted. I'm delighted to support the World Affairs Council because my life experience leads me to conclude that citizens of the United States don't understand the importance of having citizen involvement for the common good in world affairs. And so I am delighted. I'm also going to tell you my experience I've worked or taught in, I think, 32 countries on global environmental issues. And I think the United States is doing a really bad job compared to its history as a world leader on global issues for the last 20 years. And so helping citizens understand the global issues is incredibly practically important. So thank you. So let me start off with having represented the United States at the United Nations. It's made me think more deeply about the importance of global governance on problems facing the human race. Okay, there's a whole bunch of things, new technology, which offer great good, but also are risky and harmful to some people more than other people. So the problems that the human race is facing requires the world to work together for a global solution because the impacts are global and a lot of these problems can't be solved unless there's a global solution to the problems. So for the last 40 years, the world's been getting together, usually under the UN, and negotiating a set of rules. And the set of rules have to allow the good things to go ahead, but prevent the harms to the people that are getting harmed from them. So in all of the international treaties, there's a set of rules which are based upon ethics that try to make the country responsible player in global problems. Climate change is the mother of all problems that we need to understand it as an ethical and moral problem for several reasons. One is some countries more than others are causing the problem. The harms are potentially catastrophic, particularly to the poorest people. And therefore, there are certain rules that the world's already agreed to, but the United States is ignoring it. The United States has debated the climate change issue for about 35 years, arguing, and it's been debated in terms of scientific certainty or costs to the US alone. Okay, those arguments violate rules that we already agreed make those oppositions inappropriate. So in the 1992 treaty, the whole world agreed to something called the precautionary principle. And the whole world agreed that countries have a duty to prevent harm to the most vulnerable countries on the basis of equity or fairness. So this is a problem where the ethics stuff is really important to get your country to follow rules that have already been agreed to. Now, unfortunately, the United States was a global leader up until about 1980 in international environmental issues. In the 70s, after Earth Day, we developed Clean Air Act and a whole bunch of national statutes. But since 1980, the United States has been a really poor, responsible player in global governance. There's about 12 international environmental treaties. The United States by itself has not signed about 9 of them. The climate treaty, the United States has been an obstructionist in terms of things that the rest of the world wanted to do, and we have blocked, unfortunately, on a whole bunch of things. In 1997, there was something called the Kyoto Protocol. We didn't sign it. When the treaty was negotiated in 1992, the whole world wanted to make it directly enforceable. And we said no. The US, unfortunately, has been an obstructionist, not the only one. The countries with large fossil fuel industry have also been blocking progress, the OPEC countries. So anyway, the climate problem is now perceived by the scientific community as even much more dangerous than it was 5 or 6 years ago. Okay, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, the whole world agreed that the global community had to work cooperatively to limit the warming to 2 degrees Celsius, and at the most were 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the reason why those numbers were agreed to in 2015, because what scares the hell out of people, there are something like 12 feedbacks that if they're tipped, all the warming increases dramatically. And life itself is threatened if you trip some of these feedbacks. The last one was in about 52 million years ago in the Permian era. Carbon dioxide raised the atmospheric concentrations, and it raised temperatures to unlivable levels, and killing a lot of life on Earth. Right. It is not an exaggeration to say that life on Earth is actually threatened now if we tip some of these positive feedbacks. Now, this gets back to the Arctic. One of the feedbacks that the whole scientific community has been worried about for 50 years is methane from permafrost. Okay, the models that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the international institution that has great international prestige, last said the whole world has to go to net zero carbon, but by 2070 for the 2 degrees centigrade, and by 2045 for the 1.5 degrees centigrade. The impacts to parts of the world with those temperatures, those numbers were set to prevent the tripping of the feedbacks, okay? Even at 1.5 degrees centigrade, there are large parts of the world where life is unbearable. Southern Asia, Southern India, Pakistan, the small island developing states have been coming to negotiations every year and saying to the United States, don't do this to us, okay? You're killing us, okay? And that's been going on for 30 years. But how do we debate these issues in the United States? We debated these issues in terms of cost to the US alone and to scientific uncertainty. Despite the fact in the 1992 treaty, George H.W. Bush agreed that scientific uncertainties is not a legal excuse, okay? Despite the fact in 1992, we agreed to something called the no harm principle. Despite the fact that if you're violating people's human rights, you can't use cost to yourself to violate other people's human rights. Okay, so the excuse, not only we have not been leaders, the excuses that we have been using don't pass international legal tests. But we've let, climate change is a problem that even Adam Smith was worried about. Don't let the merchants run the government, okay? Okay, and the backstory, this is not theoretical. I've been in the ring at the international level representing the United States. The fossil fuel industry has been stopping the United States for 35 years and still doing it right now. And bringing scientists who've never published in peer-reviewed literature, using tactics which are deeply despicable, I believe. So the other thing is, if the Antarctic, if the Greenland ice melts, which we're now past the point from stopping it, the scientific community says it's too late to stop it.
So that's important to say. It's too late to do anything about the melting Arctic.
The Greenland ice.
The Greenland, okay.
Okay, right. The Greenland ice alone has 20 feet of sea level rise, okay?
Okay.
Okay, it's too late to prevent the Greenland ice sheet from melting. Now you're talking well over 100 years, but you're still talking about 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century from all of this melting. And the West Antarctic ice sheet has 200 feet of sea level rise. And there's a growing consensus that it may be too late to stop, that the West Antarctic ice sheet it looks like it's destabilized, so it's too late to prevent that from happening. So no matter what we do, we're going to create hardship and expense, and okay. And the United States has been the lead obstructionist. No, I don't say this from a theoretical point of view. I've been going to the climate negotiations for 25 years and watched this all happen. And the American problem, America's a great country for some things, but you can't let the corporate sector run the government. Even Adam Smith said that, okay? There's something called neoliberal economic theory, which has gained not only in the United States, but large parts of the world, where people make argument that economic growth excuses all these other problems, and is obviously a despicable argument. So we need to get excuse me.
That's all right. I mean, I hear what you're saying about, but that whole issue of the business aspect of things interfering with science is something that I think we've also experienced with COVID-19. I mean, this is an issue for Americans. What takes precedent, whether I'm hurting financially or whether the science tells me to do something to protect the earth, right? Or to protect myself.
Yeah, and to resolve those conflicts, you need a set of ethical rules that will coordinate the global approach to it. And we have some of those rules, and we're ignoring it. Okay, so global governance, which is so important for human activities which are dangerous, you need the world to get together and agree on a set of rules. Okay, we've already agreed on them. We're still not paying attention to it.
Right. Well, this video tended to show some of the positive aspects of global warming, right? I mean, it's showing that suddenly we're going to have all of these trade routes that are going to open. It's going to be easier, right, to travel, to get through this. And yet, it really didn't go deeply into how much of an impact this is having on the people who live there. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how it's impacting the actual residents.
Sure. And none of that deals with the people who were hurt the most. Okay, climate change is different than other environmental problems in the following ways. An important thing: every ton of greenhouse gases raises the atmospheric concentration globally. So all around the world, every ton is raising atmospheric CO2 from to its current 417 parts per million. So every ton of greenhouse gases is hurting other people around the world. The greenhouse gases mix. Okay, so if the United States or another country doesn't do what it says, it raises uniformly atmospheric concentrations, which is responsible for killing people. In India, Indian temperatures last year were 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, parts of the world are actually, according to the IPCC, going to be unlivable unless we make a radical change. The southern part of India, the southern part of Pakistan, and sea level
and
rise.
Parts of Africa as well, right? I mean,
the Sahel of Africa is we've been predicting for 40 years there's going to be drought. It's going to cause refugees. That has all happened. The people from the Sahel are trying to get into Europe. When I was with the federal government, we went to the Army War College to do war games over drought in Syria in 1997. They had a drought in 2001. It created 1 million refugees. The refugees on the southern border are coming from Honduras and several Central American countries. We're causing the people, we're destroying, we're creating drought and causing our own problems.
So you're saying that part of the issue we're facing, even at our own borders, is because of our unwillingness to take climate change seriously.
Absolutely, absolutely the case. So we are at least partially, if not largely, responsible for not stopping climate change, which is creating climate refugees. The World Bank predicts at 2 degrees Celsius, which is probably the best we can do if we go to 0. It's probably too late to limit the warming to 1.5. We're probably headed, even if we get the whole world to act, the whole world's probably going to go to 2 degrees centigrade. The World Bank predicts 150 million refugees at 2 degrees Celsius, okay? In addition to other really bad things. And so, you know, and so our failure is a catastrophic, indefensible, despicable failure. And we, you know, a democracy's got to have people that can debate these issues from the standpoint of the common good. Okay, what's common is democracy works if it works for the common good. And Jefferson and Adams said, don't let the rich people run the government because they won't do it. Okay, even Adam Smith said, don't let the merchants run the government. Okay, this is not a claim that free markets aren't really good for some things, but you can't let them run the government. Okay, you can't.
Let them. So Don, I hear what you're saying, that we're letting too much of pocketbook issues and business issues dictate something that is catastrophic for the world. That's also going to be catastrophic for each one of us. But let me ask you this. We know where the Trump administration was. We know we're coming out of the period where this was simply not an issue. It was off the table. Have things changed now? Is the Biden administration, from what you can see, getting religion on this?
The Biden administration started to talk in what the US obligation would be that is roughly consistent with what the US fair share would be. Biden committed to get the electricity sector to net zero. It's an amazing, by 2035, that's 14 years from now. And he committed to try to get the entire economy to go to net zero by 2050. So yeah, Biden is now talking finally at the scale of what the US should do. Okay, but that won't necessarily get it done because you still need legislation. Yes, so there's reason for hope. And
well, at least we've seen a shift in the attitude of the administration, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Now the question is, I mean, what I'm hearing from you though is that already we're behind the curve. We're late, and that there are things that have been put into motion, such as in the Arctic, that are simply not going to be. You can't clean it up. You can't go backwards. So I'm wondering, how do you inspire people now to do something, to act? What do you tell us that how can we save ourselves?
Well, we desperately need people to speak up about what's actually going on, okay? A democracy depends upon the people, the citizens responding to and demanding that the government do what is required actually morally, okay? And the solution to that is to get people to see the injustice of it, okay? So sociologists, what I respect, claim that the John Lewises of the world, okay, that help people see the injustice.
Yes.
Okay, democracies, we need a social movement that gets the government to change, okay? So that's the heart of the problem. And there is reason for hope that a social movement will arise, that the government change to eliminate the injustice. But we need we need the citizens to see the injustice. Sociologists claim that social movements are actually energized when enough people see the intolerable injustice of the world. And in our lives, we've seen that happen with, you know, civil rights and racial rights and women's rights. So part of the challenge is to get people to see the intolerable injustice of that, so it energizes a social movement.
I think part of the problem we have too. It's not just getting people to see it, because unfortunately, Americans have a tendency to distance themselves. If it's not hurting me directly, I feel sorry for you, but it's America first, right? So the issue is also how to get Americans in particular to see that they ultimately also will be hurt by this injustice.
Yeah.
That injustice is hurting that guy over there right now in Greenland or whatever, but it's going to come home to you and to your children.
Yeah, absolutely true. It's true. And we need to get them to see that too. I do think, in addition to that, we have to get more people to see that the arguments being made in opposition are morally despicable. Okay.
Morally despicable. You're right.
Okay.
Because it's killing people. It's killing,
it's
causing
killing
suffering.
people. It's not, the future is killing people right now, particularly in some parts of the world. And the sea level rise alone, I didn't tell you that the Antarctic ice sheet, there's 200 feet of sea level rise if it all melts. There's 20 feet in Greenland, okay? So this problem has to be seen as more problem because some people get hurt really badly, okay? Therefore, you can't look at it from your own economic interest. It doesn't pass minimum moral scrutiny. Right. So actually seeing the moral injustice, John Lewis, who was respected, he said, if you see a deep injustice, you got to help people see it, other people see it, okay? And that's where my hope is. And what also gives me hope, there's some young people that are really articulate about this. I'm a great fan of Greta Thunberg, okay? I've been talking about global injustice in different parts of the world for 35 years, and I've learned something from her how to do it. I'm serious, it's not a metaphor. I wrote a whole blog about what I've learned from her, about how you get people to see the injustice. And as I go around the world, there's a lot of young people that get it. And can help other people see it. Okay, so that's.
So your hope seems to be because there is a generational divide on this, but your hope is that the younger generation that's coming forward,
right,
it understands this a whole lot more, right? Well, for one thing, they've been taught it in schools, right? They actually have had lessons about climate change in schools, which we didn't have, right? So your hope is that as we see this new generation step into leadership, we will see a change in attitudes, but is it too late?
Well, the hope is in energizing social movements that demand political change, okay? And sociologists say the best hope for that is to get people to see the indefensible injustice so people voluntarily join a social movement. So that the sociologists who are brilliant on this, who I respect, say, some people say, don't politicize this. The sociologists say, no.
Politicize.
Get people to see the injustice of it, okay? Because that will energize them to become active and demand from their politicians do something. So I've been telling a lot of people, and I mean it sincerely, I've learned a lot from a 13-year-old girl about how to do this. I wrote a whole blog about what I've learned from her. Okay.
So Don, if as you go forward, we have our listeners there, what would you urge them to do to become more educated, to become more engaged, and to become activists on this? What is it that you're telling? I know you mentioned writing and contacting the lawmakers, but what else?
Well, I would, number one, it's less important for you to change your kind of car than it is to go to the Capitol and demand political. We need political change, okay? So become involved with support organizations that are trying to generate political change is the number one thing we should be doing.
Are there any organizations you think of right off the bat that you would tell them to look into?
Well, there's 4 or 5 state environmental groups. There's a whole group of people at the Unitarian Church in Harrisburg that are always trying to educate other people about what's going on in the state capitol. The state capitol, the fossil fuel industry, according to my friend Greg Vitale, there's 203 lobbyists in Harrisburg that represent the natural gas industry.
Yes.
And they're relentless in trying to stop the government from doing something. Okay, and that's intolerable for this problem. And we have to get people more to see that, so they will come out and apply political pressure. Is what I think we all should be doing.
So the Unitarian Church is one of them. Some of the state groups you're saying that.
Well, yeah, there's a whole group of churches. It's the Pennsylvania Power and Light is called.
Pennsylvania Power and Light. Okay. All right. Good.
Okay, they're working on this together. They're trying to organize social movements to put pressure on the politicians. So that's where I would put my hope.
So I would think right now you must be a little more optimistic about where things are headed. What can you look ahead and see what else you would advise the Biden, because I'm sure he'll listen to you. What else you would advise the Biden administration to do to begin really galvanizing things?
So he's announced his plans to generate a set of policies that will lower the emissions in Pennsylvania to net zero. Okay, it's an enormous challenge, but he said we're going to do it, and it can be done. There are now 12 countries that have said zero. Okay, including Japan and China. China recently set a target of net zero. So all of a sudden, countries around the world, this would be foolish to think this could happen. 5 years ago, the fact that there would be a bunch of countries setting greenhouse gas targets to zero would seem foolish, but it's actually starting to happen. And there are cities around the world. I've looked at 54 cities that are doing really aggressive things on climate change, going to all zero cars, putting in charging stations, and making it easier for all of us to, what we've got to do is get out of fossil fuel combustion, or find a fossil fuel combustion source that removes the carbon and buries it. Okay, so, but it's starting to happen at a surprisingly fast rate compared to what I would have guessed 4 or 5 years ago. And
so how is Pennsylvania doing in particular, our area?
It's doing badly. Okay, it's compared to other states. Now the governor has signed an executive order, which is pretty ambitious, but still not strong enough in my view, which is a whole nother subject, but it's much better than any other governor suggested. He set a target of, I think, reducing greenhouse gases by 80% by 2050, I think, but it's still not good enough. But there are, in the House, there are organized, regular events where the fossil fuel industry is trying to stop him, okay, from doing it. So it's not at all clear he's going to do what he said he was going to do now. So you go to these hearings and there are 30 or 40 lobbyists from the natural gas industry trying to stop the governor, as they have. I'll just tell you one story. I had the lead for the United States in negotiating whether the whole world would agree in 1998 that the climate change was human caused, it wasn't kind of natural variability. So I had to sit through all that and learn the science. And every country in the world agreed in 1997 that the evidence demonstrates it's not natural variability, which is the story that the fossil fuel industry has been pushing through disinformation. It's human caused. I came back to the governor at the time and I said, Pennsylvania's got to do something. And we decided to have a hearing where we would bring the fossil fuel industry in to help us do this. And they said to the state, this is in 1998, that if you even talk about this, we'll cut DEP's budget. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So they have been actively and successfully preventing the state from doing what it should be doing. And
so there's no way to convince them to kind of co-opt them. This is just a battle between the pocketbook and science, right?
Yeah. Well, those issues should be thought about deeply. Okay. And it's not that I and others haven't been trying to do. There's a couple of legislators that really get it. One was a guy named Greg Vitale, who's been doing it for 20 years. The last time I was in his office, we go out to lunch like once every 4 months. He was sitting at his desk crying. He was so deeply disturbed that the lobbyists were preventing something which is in the world's interest. So
yeah,
unfortunately, fossil fuel has done some good things, but they have been indefensible on this. They've brought a whole series of witnesses to hearings that they've never participated in the peer-reviewed science. They make claims which are complete disinformation. This really is some kind of new crime against humanity. I think that's a whole nother story. Sociologists have rigorously defined how the fossil fuel industry over 20 years has successfully funded a disinformation campaign. How they've done it, what tactics they've used with front groups and think tanks and commercials. So they've been at it for 25 years. And that's responsible why the US hasn't been doing it. The populace has been confused, even though every scientific organization in the world supports what is called the consensus view. So,
and I do have to ask you, I mean, frankly, our disinformation, misinformation, and outright lies has been, the characteristic of things for the past few years, it seems. Yeah. But I guess what do you do? How do people make sure? I mean, when you're talking about climate change, are there clear places you can go that it's reliable information?
Well, the question of how what sources should is important to talk about. Well, sorry.
That's all right. Mm-hmm.
Every scientific organization whose members publish and peer reviewed supports the consensus view. Every academy of science in the world, there's 19 or 20 of them. Okay.
So the science is settled. The science is settled.
The science of human causation is completely settled. Okay. There's some issues about how much, how quickly, but the fact that we're doing something really dangerous and headed for trouble is completely settled. Okay. And anyone that says it isn't, the academies of science, okay, have all issued statements. The US Academy of Sciences issued 5 reports over 20 years, and they said that it's all settled, okay? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said it's all settled. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has scientists from every country in the world. Every 5 years, they synthesize the peer-reviewed literature.
Right.
And they have a whole list of reasons why the science is settled, that if it can't be natural variability. So
we got it set, but there are 2 quick things I want to ask you before, because I see we're out of our time here. The one also is, it does look like we could have a military confrontation in the Arctic. We could have real serious problems there between China, the US, and Russia. But it also looks like there's a push to start drilling in the Arctic. So just talk about those 2 things.
Okay, well, that's a really important thing. The whole Russia-Ukraine thing was about whether Russia could sell its oil to Ukraine. Okay, so there's so many global problems which are really about oil. Okay, I'll just tell you one story. Part of my job, I had to have a security clearance for EPA, and my job was required me to look at secret cables that came in overnight about global environmental issues. And every day I would go in and I'd read about 50 secret cables. Ooh. And 90% of them were about who got the oil, okay? So the State Department is deeply involved in whether US interests get the oil. That's been part of the problem. That's what Russia and Ukraine has been about, okay? Russia, there was a large deposit of oil in the north of Siberia that they discovered, and they couldn't drill it. And they got Exxon, they got Rex Tillerson about 8 months before Trump made him Secretary of State to sign a agreement so Exxon would drill the Russian oil. Yeah, so there are big issues, and they're still going on. about who's going to make money out of the large deposits of fossil fuels, which are in the Arctic.
Right, right.
So that's going on too, and that's
but that will only hurt the whole global warming thing if they start drilling for fossil fuels, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
Right.
We have to get out of fossil fuel orbit. We got to go to zero. There are a lot of people trying to get oil companies to admit that, you know. So that's another issue. But yeah, the Arctic is full of these potential international conflicts over who gets access to the oil. Okay.
Let me just read two of these. I see Terry is saying today President Biden posed the future as one between autocracy and democracy.
Right.
Would autocracy be more effective? That's a good question in fighting the dangers of climate change. If we just had an autocrat who was in favor of pulling this thing in, would that be easier?
Unfortunately, autocracy usually works for the people with the power.
Which is the money, which are the merchants.
Yes, so we have seen, anyone that's awake have noticed that the similarities between the rise of fascism in the world, which has worked for the wealthy, and what's been happening in the United States. There's a woman who's probably the best respected political science in the world. Her name is Hannah Arendt, which I had as a teacher at the New School in New York, who wrote brilliantly about, if you let the people with the money, they will tend towards fascism and aristocracy. So this is a democracy problem, okay?
Yeah.
All of this is, it's how do you make democracy work for the common good, not for the good of people with special interess.
And Mary is saying, unfortunately, this is very interesting. People react to fear more than ethical issues. She says the mass immigration that is already happening, look at our southern border, which you talked about, is alarming and threatening people in the United States. This is going to be worldwide, she says. When is this going to sink in with people, not only in the US, but around the world? Excellent point, Mary, excellent point. I mean, I think what she's getting at is that if you won't act on ethics, if you won't act on morality, maybe you'll act on fear, the fact that look what this is doing to you.
We could say a lot more just about that one issue. The problem is people don't see the ethical issues. They get tricked into following the economic issues.
Okay? Right. So but she's saying maybe fear would even be better if we just told them how horrible this is going to be for you.
Yeah. Sociologists claim that the way power gets its way is they trick people to setting up the issue, and then they frame the issue. So in climate change, they frame it as cost to us and scientific uncertainty. And most people don't see through it. Okay, that's okay.
Well, one final thing here says, does the increasing awareness, this goes into the fear thing, does the increasing awareness of coastal flooding in the United States give you any hope that people will be forced to realize climate change is here and it's hurting you?
Yeah, my antenna says because of this thing, more people every day are seeing the seriousness of it. We're still not at the scale that we need, but there is reason for hope, I think. And,
well, very good. This has been fascinating as usual. Okay. You have brought us clarity on this, but go ahead. You want to have a final?
No, I thank you for, you can tell I believe we all have a duty to educate the public about this, and that's what you're doing. So thank you for doing it.
And thank you for taking your time. And guess, I just want you to know, Don is really every day he's speaking to people around the world about this. He's committed, he's dedicated, but more than that, he truly knows what he's talking about. He's an expert who's spent his life looking at this issue. So Don, thank you so much. Keep up the good fight.
Thank you for what you're doing. I really appreciate it.
All right. Good night, everyone. Enjoy. See you next